In the 1980s, the world was watching as one of the most dangerous and powerful criminal organizations in history emerged from the dark heart of Colombia. A shadow had fallen over the nation, spreading fear, violence, and corruption in its wake. This was no ordinary criminal syndicate, it was the Medellín Cartel, a ruthless, highly efficient organization that at its peak would control more than 80% of the world's cocaine market. The mere mention of the cartel's name sent chills down the spines of law enforcement and governments alike, as its influence was so vast, it almost seemed untouchable. What made this cartel so terrifying wasn't just its reach, it was its audacity, its disregard for life, and its ability to outgun not only rival cartels but also the very government of Colombia itself. At the helm of this empire was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, a man whose name became synonymous with cocaine, money, and blood. Escobar wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, far from it. He was born into a poor family in the small town of Rio Negro, in the department of Antioquia, on December 1, 1949. The Escobar family was hardly in the business of crime. His father, a farmer, and his mother, a schoolteacher, raised Pablo in a modest home. But Escobar's hunger for something greater than his humble beginnings drove him down a darker path. As a child, he was known for his audacity, even at a young age. By the time he was a teenager, Pablo had already begun to display a ruthless drive to succeed, one that would propel him to unimaginable heights of power. Escobar's initial forays into crime were not much different from those of any other aspiring criminal in Medellín, a city that was rapidly becoming a hub for illegal activities. He started by selling fake diplomas, stealing cars, and engaging in petty extortion. But it wasn't long before he realized that he could make far more money by tapping into the lucrative cocaine trade. As the 1970s unfolded, the demand for cocaine was surging, especially in the United States, and Escobar saw an opportunity to build a fortune that could rival any legal businessman. He quickly made connections with other criminals, and soon, the fledgling Medellín Cartel began to form. The cartel, at first, operated much like any small-time drug syndicate, but Escobar's ambitions knew no bounds. Unlike many others, he had a keen sense of business, and this allowed him to see the bigger picture. He wasn't just interested in controlling the local market. He wanted to dominate the world. His charisma and ruthlessness attracted the loyalty of some of the most dangerous men in the business, and with these allies, he quickly began to build his empire. Together, they began smuggling large quantities of cocaine into the United States, making huge profits. But while other cartels operated quietly, Escobar had a vision. He wanted to be the king of this empire, the one whose name everyone feared. It wasn't just the power and money that drove him, it was something deeper, something that made Escobar different from the countless other criminals vying for dominance. He believed in his own legend. To him, the cartel was not just a criminal enterprise, it was a mission. He wasn't just building an empire for wealth, he was creating a lasting legacy, one that would echo through history. And as the money poured in, Escobar's ambitions grew even more. His strategy was as simple as it was brutal: eliminate anyone who stood in his way, whether they were rival drug dealers, law enforcement officers, or even government officials. In this world of crime, loyalty was bought, not earned, and Escobar had learned how to master the art of manipulation. By the early 1980s, Escobar's Medellín Cartel had become a global force. The cocaine that once flowed in small, illegal shipments was now being produced in massive quantities, and Escobar was the mastermind behind it all. His cartel controlled nearly every aspect of the cocaine trade, from production to distribution to transportation. He even had his own fleet of planes, boats, and submarines to ensure the drugs made it to the United States, where demand for cocaine was reaching unprecedented levels. With each successful shipment, the cartel's power and wealth grew. Escobar was no longer just a drug lord, he was a king. But power comes at a price, and Escobar was about to learn that the very empire he built could also destroy him. As the Medellín Cartel's influence spread, it attracted the attention of authorities, both in Colombia and abroad. The Colombian government, which had long been corrupt and ineffective, found itself unable to contain the violence and chaos unleashed by the cartel. Escobar, ever the shrewd strategist, recognized this vulnerability and used it to his advantage. He was able to buy off politicians, police officers, and military officials, creating a network of corruption that allowed him to operate with relative impunity. The government's attempts to stop him were always thwarted, and Escobar began to see himself not as a criminal, but as a man above the law, untouchable. His power extended beyond Colombia's borders. With his vast wealth, Escobar began to influence governments, both in Latin America and in the United States. He made enormous bribes to public officials and law enforcement officers, ensuring that no one would stand in his way. Meanwhile, his cartel's reach continued to grow, and with it, the violence escalated. The Medellín Cartel was responsible for countless assassinations, bombings, and murders, including the deaths of several high-profile politicians and journalists. In 1989, the cartel's brutality reached new heights when it orchestrated the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, killing over 100 innocent people. But the more power Escobar accumulated, the more paranoid he became. By the mid-1980s, the government and law enforcement agencies were beginning to turn their attention to him, and Escobar's empire began to show cracks. Escobar, once confident in his ability to control everything, now found himself surrounded by enemies, rival cartels, the government, and even his own former allies. The once untouchable kingpin began to realize that his reign, built on violence and fear, was starting to unravel. In response, Escobar took drastic measures to protect himself. His paranoia intensified, and he began to lash out at anyone he suspected of betrayal. He even went so far as to threaten the Colombian government with a private war if they dared to extradite him to the United States. He demanded that the Colombian constitution be amended so that he could avoid facing charges in the U.S. This created a deadly standoff between Escobar and the Colombian government, a battle that would ultimately shape the future of both Escobar and the nation. Despite his efforts to hold on to power, Escobar's empire began to crumble. The government, with the help of U.S. intelligence agencies, ramped up its efforts to capture him. Eventually, Escobar was forced to go into hiding, living in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. His once grand empire, with its luxurious mansions, fleets of cars, and millions of dollars in cash, now lay in ruins. But even in hiding, Escobar remained a symbol of the power he once wielded. His name was known around the world, and his story became a legend. As the hunt for Escobar intensified, so did the violence. His final years were marked by increasingly violent confrontations with the Colombian authorities, the U.S. government, and rival drug cartels. In the end, the very empire he had built would be the cause of his downfall. On December 2, 1993, Escobar was killed in a firefight with Colombian National Police on the rooftops of Medellín, bringing an end to one of the most infamous criminal reigns in history. Yet, his legacy, both the terror he left behind and the myth he created, remains to this day, a testament to the power and the peril of living above the law. This is the story of the Medellín Cartel, of Pablo Escobar's rise to power, and of the unimaginable empire he built and ultimately destroyed. The shadows of Escobar's reign may have faded, but the scars left on Colombia and the world are still felt today. The legacy of the Medellín Cartel is a chilling reminder of how far one man, and one cartel, could go to reshape the world. Pablo Escobar's rise to power was anything but inevitable. Born into the rural town of Rio Negro, Colombia, in 1949, his story was not one that would have predicted the immense shadow he would eventually cast over not just Colombia, but the world. His parents, a simple farmer and a schoolteacher, didn't have the means to offer their son the luxuries of the elite. Escobar was a product of humble beginnings, yet even as a child, his ambition burned with a fierce intensity. While other children in his town played and dreamt of becoming doctors or engineers, Escobar was already thinking in terms of power, influence, and wealth, often showing an uncanny talent for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. From an early age, Pablo displayed signs of a calculating mind, capable of seeing opportunities where others saw only limitations. His ambition led him down roads that many of his contemporaries would never dare to travel. He was always a bit of an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit into the norms of his small town. It was in his teenage years that Escobar first dabbled in criminal activity. He began his career as a small-time hustler, earning money by stealing gravestones, reselling them, and even forging documents. It was said that he had a natural ability to charm, to manipulate people into doing what he wanted, and it wasn't long before he realized that his true calling lay in the criminal underworld, where the rewards were far greater than what he could ever hope to earn legally. It wasn't just his desire for wealth that drove him, though, it was a deep, underlying need for recognition and respect. In a country like Colombia, where inequality ran deep, many people found themselves boxed in by their circumstances. Escobar wasn't content to be a nameless face in the crowd, he wanted to be something more, to dominate the very system that kept people like him suppressed. His journey into the world of crime, therefore, wasn't just about money, it was about power, influence, and a sense of control over a world that seemed determined to keep him at the bottom. As the 1970s unfolded, Colombia found itself at a crossroads. Its cities, like Medellín, were becoming increasingly unstable, plagued by violence and a growing drug trade. Cocaine was beginning to rise in prominence, both as a commodity and as a weapon for those who wished to exert control. This was the environment that Escobar would exploit. His entry into the cocaine trade was, in many ways, a stroke of genius. While many of his competitors were focused on other criminal endeavors, Escobar recognized the emerging power of cocaine as both a product and an industry. He saw that the demand for it, particularly in the United States, was set to explode, and he quickly moved to control this new market. Escobar's first steps in the cocaine trade were marked by an almost ruthless efficiency. He began by forging relationships with local farmers who could supply the raw product, while simultaneously finding ways to smuggle the cocaine out of Colombia and into the United States. From the outset, he used a combination of bribery, violence, and cunning business tactics to ensure that nothing, and no one, would stand in his way. His drive was relentless, and it wasn't long before Escobar's operation grew from a small-time venture into a full-fledged cartel, one that would come to dominate the cocaine industry for decades. The rise of the Medellín Cartel was swift and dramatic. By the mid-1970s, Escobar's operation was already becoming one of the largest in the world, with shipments of cocaine flooding into the U.S. at an unprecedented scale. His network of smuggling routes spanned the globe, with planes, boats, and even submarines being used to move the drugs across borders and into the hands of buyers. Escobar's empire was built on a combination of fear and loyalty. He cultivated a fiercely loyal group of allies, men who would do anything to protect their leader and the massive profits they were making. At the same time, he was not above using brutal tactics to silence those who posed a threat to his rise. Rival drug dealers, law enforcement officers, and even politicians who stood in his way found themselves victims of his cruelty, whether through assassination, bombings, or other forms of terror. By the late 1970s, Escobar's personal wealth had reached staggering heights. His earnings from the cocaine trade were measured in billions of dollars, and he was quickly becoming one of the wealthiest men in the world. He built lavish homes, owned fleets of luxury cars, and made extravagant displays of his power. But for Escobar, this wealth was not just for personal indulgence, it was a tool to further cement his position as a kingpin, someone whose influence extended beyond the criminal world. His success was not just measured by the money he made, but by the power he wielded over others, including politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officials. He had effectively become untouchable. Despite the fear and destruction that Escobar left in his wake, he was not without his admirers. In Medellín, he was seen by some as a modern-day Robin Hood. He built schools, soccer fields, and hospitals in the poorest areas, and he gave away large sums of money to the people. In his eyes, he was not just a drug lord, he was a man of the people, someone who had come from humble beginnings and was now using his wealth to help those who were struggling, just as he had once struggled. This image of Escobar as a benefactor made him even more dangerous. It masked the true extent of his criminal empire and helped shield him from the full wrath of the government, who were too often willing to turn a blind eye to his activities, or simply too corrupt to take action. But as his power grew, so did the risks. The same ruthlessness that had helped him rise to the top began to catch up with him. By the early 1980s, Escobar's cartel had become the largest drug trafficking organization in the world, and the Colombian government began to take notice. However, the authorities were powerless against Escobar's influence. He had effectively infiltrated every corner of the Colombian government, buying off police officers, judges, and even the president. For a time, Escobar seemed invincible, an untouchable figure whose empire could not be brought down by any force, not even the government itself. He seemed to be above the law, a man who could act with impunity, knowing that nothing could stop him. Escobar's success was not just a testament to his cunning and ruthlessness, but also to the strategic alliances he made along the way. His connections with other drug lords, corrupt officials, and businesspeople helped cement his place at the top. His ability to navigate the world of crime, politics, and business allowed him to stay one step ahead of those who sought to bring him down. Escobar was not just a drug lord, he was a master manipulator, a man who knew how to play the game of power like few others. But this would not last forever. As the 1980s wore on, the sheer scale of Escobar's operation began to attract the attention of the international community. The United States, in particular, became increasingly concerned about the flow of cocaine into its borders, and the violence that accompanied it. With the help of the Colombian government, the U.S. began to ramp up efforts to bring Escobar to justice. But as the authorities closed in, Escobar's paranoia grew. He saw enemies everywhere, and the very network of loyalty and corruption that had helped him rise to power began to fray. In his desperation, Escobar resorted to even more extreme measures to maintain control. He began to threaten the government with violence, including the threat of blowing up airplanes and other public targets. He even went so far as to offer a deal to the government: if they stopped the extradition of Colombian criminals to the United States, he would cease his violent campaign. This dark offer would ultimately lead to a series of devastating events that would reshape the course of Escobar's life, and lead to his eventual downfall. Escobar's ambition, his thirst for power, and his belief that he was untouchable ultimately became his undoing. As the authorities closed in, he found himself trapped in a dangerous game of survival. His empire, once a symbol of wealth and power, began to crumble under the weight of law enforcement pressure, betrayal from within his own ranks, and his own spiraling paranoia. And yet, despite all of this, Escobar remained a man driven by one thing: control. Control over his empire, control over his legacy, and control over the people who depended on him. As his reign continued to spiral out of control, one thing became clear: Escobar's ambition, which had once driven him to greatness, would ultimately lead to his tragic fall. The man who had once been a hero to the poor and a king in the world of crime would eventually become a hunted man, forced to live in hiding, his empire reduced to dust. His story, full of ambition, betrayal, and bloodshed, would go down in history as one of the most infamous criminal tales ever told, a reminder of the dark power of ambition, and the price that must be paid for living outside the law. As the 1970s unfolded, the world of drug trafficking was undergoing a massive transformation, and the small-time dealers of the past were quickly being eclipsed by ruthless and strategic players with visions of global empires. This was the environment that Escobar and his Medellín Cartel would use to their advantage. What began as a small, localized operation, primarily focused on smuggling cocaine into the United States, soon became a vast criminal empire with reach and influence that stretched across the globe. And at the helm of this empire was Pablo Escobar, a man whose ambition knew no limits and whose thirst for power would redefine the nature of the drug trade forever. By the mid-1970s, the cocaine trade was booming in Colombia, and Escobar, already well on his way to becoming one of the most feared and powerful criminals in the country, saw an opportunity to exploit the growing demand in the United States. The demand for cocaine was spiking, with a growing market of affluent Americans eager to indulge in the powdery, illicit drug. Escobar's ambition led him to make a bold decision: he would not just be a middleman in this industry, but its kingpin, its supreme authority. He wasn't content to simply trade in the product, he wanted to control every aspect of it, from its production in the jungles of Colombia, to its smuggling through the most dangerous routes, to its final sale on the streets of America. This was the birth of the Medellín Cartel in its true form. Escobar's first critical move was securing a steady and reliable source of cocaine. He did not rely solely on other growers or producers, instead, he worked to control the entire supply chain. He made alliances with local farmers in rural Colombia, many of whom were desperate for money and willing to work with the cartel in exchange for a piece of the profits. But Escobar didn't just settle for working with farmers, he expanded his control into the very heart of Colombia's cocaine production. He was involved in every stage of the process, from cultivating the coca plant to turning it into pure cocaine. His cartel wasn't just involved in trafficking, it was embedded in the production itself. This vertical integration allowed Escobar to keep costs low and profits high, making him one of the most powerful figures in the drug trade. But producing the cocaine was only half the battle. Smuggling it into the United States, where the market for the drug was expanding rapidly, was a far more complex and dangerous endeavor. The U.S. government, particularly in the 1970s and early 1980s, was becoming increasingly aware of the rising tide of drug trafficking, and law enforcement agencies were beginning to step up their efforts to curtail the flow of cocaine. However, Escobar, ever the strategist, was quick to recognize the weaknesses in the U.S. system and adapt. He established a network of smuggling routes that used a combination of planes, boats, and even submarines to get the cocaine from Colombia to the United States. These were not just ordinary smugglers, Escobar's operation was meticulous, with every shipment carefully planned to avoid detection by authorities. One of Escobar's most innovative smuggling tactics involved the use of mules, individuals who would swallow packets of cocaine and transport them across borders in their stomachs. These mules were often unaware of the scale of their operation, they were simply paid to carry the drugs in exchange for a fee. At the same time, Escobar's cartel also used a fleet of planes to transport larger shipments. These planes would fly from the jungles of Colombia to remote airstrips in the United States, often landing in the dead of night to avoid detection. The sheer scale of Escobar's operation was unlike anything the U.S. authorities had ever seen, and his ability to elude capture was a testament to his strategic genius and his deep understanding of the inner workings of the drug trade. The cartel's growing dominance in the cocaine market was also due to its sophisticated money laundering operations. Escobar and his associates used a wide range of tactics to launder the vast sums of cash the cartel generated. One of the most ingenious schemes involved the purchase of real estate across Colombia and beyond. Escobar bought dozens of properties, from luxurious estates to smaller, inconspicuous buildings, all of which served as fronts for the cartel's illicit operations. The money would flow through these properties, making it appear as though the wealth had come from legitimate sources. In addition, Escobar invested heavily in businesses, ranging from construction companies to soccer teams, further masking the true origins of his vast fortune. While Escobar's wealth continued to multiply, so too did his power. By the late 1970s, he had begun to buy off key figures in the Colombian government, law enforcement, and the military. His vast fortune allowed him to forge relationships with politicians who were more than willing to turn a blind eye to his criminal activities in exchange for bribes. In some cases, he even went as far as to offer political donations to help fund their campaigns, ensuring that his influence extended into the very halls of power. This corrupt network gave Escobar the ability to operate with impunity, knowing that even if law enforcement did come knocking, they would be met with resistance from within their own ranks. Escobar's growing power also attracted the attention of rival drug cartels, and the Medellín Cartel found itself in direct competition with other powerful groups, such as the Cali Cartel. This rivalry would later escalate into a full-blown war, with each side fighting for control over the cocaine trade in Colombia. However, Escobar, ever the tactician, was not one to back down from a fight. He quickly learned the art of intimidation and violence, using these tactics to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. The Medellín Cartel's rise to dominance was marked by brutal murders, bombings, and assassinations, all orchestrated by Escobar's men. His cartel didn't just deal in drugs, they were masters of terror, capable of striking fear into the hearts of both their rivals and anyone who dared to oppose them. But the success of the Medellín Cartel wasn't just about violence and intimidation, it was also about creating a sense of loyalty among those who worked for Escobar. Many of his closest allies came from his hometown of Medellín, and Escobar saw them as more than just employees, he saw them as family. This sense of camaraderie and loyalty became a hallmark of the cartel, and Escobar was able to surround himself with a trusted inner circle that would follow him to the ends of the earth. In return for their loyalty, Escobar offered them riches beyond their wildest dreams. His associates, many of whom were former street-level criminals, were now living lives of luxury, enjoying the fruits of their criminal endeavors. As the Medellín Cartel's influence spread across Colombia and beyond, Escobar's notoriety grew. He became a household name, both in Colombia and internationally, as the face of the cocaine trade. He was the king of an empire built on violence, fear, and greed. But as his power grew, so too did his paranoia. Escobar became increasingly distrustful of those around him, fearing that betrayal was always lurking just around the corner. This paranoia would eventually come to define his reign, and it was this fear of betrayal that would lead to the unraveling of the Medellín Cartel. But at the height of his power, Escobar was living a life that few could have imagined. He was not just a drug lord, he was a king, with a vast empire that spanned continents. He owned countless properties, planes, cars, and boats, living a life of unimaginable luxury. He was able to live without fear, as long as he could continue to control the flow of cocaine. However, as the cartel grew, so too did the attention it attracted. The Colombian government, under increasing pressure from the United States and its own citizens, began to crack down on the Medellín Cartel. The power and influence that Escobar had fought so hard to build were beginning to come under threat. The increasing efforts by law enforcement and the rival cartels marked the beginning of the end for the Medellín Cartel. Escobar, however, was not a man to go down without a fight. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances and his sheer will to survive would ensure that his name would go down in history, not just as a drug lord, but as a man who created one of the most powerful and dangerous criminal organizations the world had ever seen. His cartel's reach and power were so vast that, even after his eventual fall from grace, the legacy of the Medellín Cartel would live on. And Escobar's story, his rise, his empire, and his eventual demise, would be retold for generations to come. As the Medellín Cartel expanded, so too did the scope of its operations. The success of Pablo Escobar's empire wasn't merely a product of luck or timing, it was the result of a carefully crafted, highly organized system that could outsmart both the authorities and its rivals. With each passing year, the cartel's reach spread further across Colombia, into the United States, and even beyond, creating a web of criminal activities that extended from small, rural towns to the largest urban centers in the world. The cartel's operations were vast, efficient, and often invisible, leaving no trace of its involvement unless one looked carefully at the blood-stained path it left behind. The cartel's operations were built on a foundation of secrecy and sophistication. In the beginning, Escobar and his associates had to rely on local smuggling routes, using small planes and boats to move cocaine from the jungles of Colombia to the United States. But as their business grew, so did their need for more efficient, large-scale logistics. Escobar understood that the key to maintaining control over the cocaine trade was to create a system that could move vast amounts of product with minimal risk of detection. With this goal in mind, he expanded his operations, incorporating new methods of transportation, money laundering, and smuggling routes that bypassed the usual law enforcement scrutiny. One of the most ingenious aspects of the Medellín Cartel's rise was its ability to control the production process from start to finish. Escobar didn't just rely on external suppliers, he took a hands-on approach, establishing his own network of coca farmers deep in the Colombian jungle. By controlling the entire supply chain, Escobar ensured that no middleman would take a cut of the profits. This gave him an immense advantage over rival cartels, who were forced to rely on independent farmers or smaller, fragmented networks. Escobar's operation, on the other hand, was integrated from top to bottom. Cocaine wasn't just being produced in vast quantities, it was also being smuggled out with military precision. The cartel's fleet of planes, often flying under the radar at night, could transport large shipments to airstrips in the United States, evading detection by law enforcement agencies. But smuggling cocaine into the U.S. wasn't just about planes and boats, it was also about creating complex routes and hidden systems to ensure that each shipment arrived safely and without incident. The cartel relied on a network of mules, trusted couriers who would swallow packets of cocaine, transporting them inside their bodies. This method of transportation allowed the cartel to get past airport security and customs checks, using human couriers to carry small amounts of the drug into the U.S. at a time. While each mule might only carry a small quantity of cocaine, the sheer volume of these operations meant that millions of dollars worth of drugs were slipping past the authorities every day. Escobar's ingenuity didn't stop with the transportation of cocaine. His cartel also built an extensive money laundering network, one that was almost as sophisticated as their drug trafficking operation. With billions of dollars flooding in from the sale of cocaine, the cartel had to find ways to conceal its earnings and make them appear legitimate. Escobar and his associates used a variety of tactics to clean their money, buying properties, opening businesses, and investing in legitimate industries. These included everything from construction companies to hotels, nightclubs, and soccer teams. One of Escobar's most well-known investments was his purchase of the Colombian soccer team Atlético Nacional. This was more than just a passion project, it was a way to launder money and cement his position as a respected, influential figure in Colombian society. In Escobar's mind, the line between legitimate business and his illicit empire was thin and flexible, and he used every opportunity to blend the two. The Medellín Cartel's influence stretched far beyond Colombia's borders. In the United States, the cartel had established connections with powerful figures in the drug world, as well as corrupt officials in law enforcement and government. Escobar's network in the U.S. was vast, with a sprawling network of distributors, dealers, and street-level operations. While the cartel's primary focus was the East Coast and Miami, its reach extended into cities all across the country. The cartel was so well established in some parts of the U.S. that it was virtually untouchable. Law enforcement agencies, already overburdened with other criminal activities, struggled to keep up with the sheer scale of the Medellín Cartel's operations. The cartel's rise to dominance wasn't just due to its superior logistics or vast smuggling routes. It was also about power, intimidation, and fear. Escobar's ability to control and manipulate both law enforcement and government officials played a critical role in the cartel's success. His method was simple: buy loyalty or use violence to ensure compliance. Escobar understood that in order to maintain his empire, he needed to control the political landscape of Colombia. This meant buying off politicians, judges, police officers, and even military leaders. The level of corruption that Escobar was able to foster in Colombia's government was staggering. In some instances, he was able to influence elections, funneling money into the campaigns of those who would do his bidding. The cartel's influence was not just limited to Colombia or the United States. As Escobar's empire grew, so did his connections with international drug traffickers. By the early 1980s, Escobar was forging alliances with powerful cartels in Mexico, the Caribbean, and even Europe. These alliances allowed the Medellín Cartel to expand its reach even further, creating a truly global operation that involved the transportation and distribution of cocaine to the farthest corners of the world. The cartel became a central node in the global drug trade, and Escobar's name was known in every major city from Bogotá to Miami, from New York to Madrid. But with this vast network came immense risk. As the cartel's operations grew, so did the attention from law enforcement agencies, both in Colombia and the United States. The Colombian government, which had long been inept and corrupt, found itself under increasing pressure to take action against the Medellín Cartel. But Escobar was not someone who could be easily toppled. He knew that the key to his survival lay in keeping the government weak and divided, and he did this by continuing to bribe officials, creating a network of loyalty that extended all the way to the top. In exchange for their silence, he offered them money, power, and protection. The cartel's operations were not just profitable, they were also brutal. In order to maintain control and eliminate any threat to his empire, Escobar used violence as a primary tool. Rival cartels, law enforcement officials, and even innocent civilians who got in the way of his operations were targeted for assassination. It wasn't enough for Escobar to simply kill his enemies, he wanted to send a message. Bombings, shootings, and even public executions were all part of the Medellín Cartel's strategy. In many ways, Escobar's ability to use terror and fear as a tool of control was one of the reasons the cartel remained so powerful for so long. One of the most notorious tactics employed by the cartel was its use of bombings. Escobar had a penchant for sending explosive messages to his rivals or anyone who dared to challenge him. One of the most infamous incidents was the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in 1989, which killed over 100 people. The bombing was a direct response to the government's efforts to capture Escobar and to send a message to the authorities that he would stop at nothing to maintain control. The attack was devastating, and it left the Colombian public in shock. For Escobar, it was another calculated move to remind everyone that he was untouchable. Despite the extreme measures employed by the cartel, Escobar's power and influence continued to grow. His ability to evade law enforcement, maintain control over vast territories, and manipulate the political system made him one of the most dangerous men in the world. But even as he sat atop his empire, Escobar was becoming increasingly paranoid. The government, the media, and rival cartels were closing in on him, and he was beginning to feel the weight of his own empire. It was clear that the more power Escobar gained, the more dangerous the game became. As the cartel's operations continued to evolve, so did the danger, and Escobar's ability to stay ahead of his enemies was becoming increasingly uncertain. However, at this moment, he remained an unstoppable force, a criminal mastermind with a global reach and an empire that seemed invincible. As the 1980s progressed, Pablo Escobar's power seemed invincible, but beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. His empire was built on the manipulation of people, governments, and systems, but such a complex web was always prone to collapse. Escobar's fear of betrayal, whether from rivals, allies, or even his own government, grew with every passing day. Paranoia set in, and the man who had once been untouchable was now surrounded by enemies on all sides. What had once been a smooth, well-oiled machine of corruption, violence, and wealth was beginning to fray. Despite this growing vulnerability, Escobar continued to play his game with the same audacity and cunning that had brought him to the top in the first place. But he was beginning to understand that no empire, no matter how vast, could last forever. Escobar's paranoia was not unfounded. His enemies, both within Colombia and abroad, were growing more coordinated. The U.S. government had intensified its efforts to dismantle the Medellín Cartel, offering rewards for information, deploying intelligence agents, and pressuring Colombia to take action against Escobar. However, it wasn't just external forces that posed a threat, internal struggles were beginning to destabilize his network. The Medellín Cartel was vast, but its foundations were built on fear and loyalty that, while strong, were fragile under pressure. Discontent began to bubble to the surface, as some members of the cartel realized they were expendable, and that Escobar's reign was becoming increasingly dangerous for them. The atmosphere of betrayal, violence, and mistrust soon spread throughout the ranks. This growing instability did not deter Escobar, however. Instead of retreating, he became more aggressive, doubling down on his violent tactics. In his mind, he was still the king of the world, and anyone who crossed him, whether friend or foe, would feel his wrath. The terrifying extent of his control was evident in the fact that he could literally reshape the political landscape of Colombia through sheer force of will. He wasn't merely a criminal, he was a power broker. Escobar's influence extended into the highest offices of government, including the presidency. He had cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials for years, creating a network of corruption that allowed him to function with relative impunity. But as his grip on power began to loosen, these same figures started to distance themselves from him. The Colombian government was now under immense pressure to act, not just from the United States, but from their own citizens, who had grown weary of the violence and instability Escobar had created. Escobar, knowing that his enemies were closing in, resorted to an even darker tactic: terrorism. His cartel's actions in the 1980s became more extreme, and Escobar's use of bombings escalated as a way to strike fear into his enemies and destabilize the Colombian government. The most shocking and tragic of these attacks was the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in 1989, which killed 110 people, including several innocent civilians. The bombing was a direct response to the Colombian government's increased efforts to extradite drug criminals to the United States. Escobar, who had long been vocal about his opposition to extradition, saw the attack as a way to force the government to relent. In his mind, it was a calculated move, a demonstration of his willingness to go to any length to protect his empire. However, the attack only served to further alienate him from the Colombian public, who were already growing disillusioned with his reign of terror. The more Escobar tried to control the narrative through violence, the more he alienated those who had once supported him. The aftermath of the Avianca bombing was profound. The Colombian government, already under immense pressure, finally took a hard stance against Escobar. The American government, too, was intensifying its efforts to capture him, with the full backing of U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA. They were determined to bring Escobar to justice, and the stakes were higher than ever. Escobar's ability to evade capture for so long was a testament to his cunning and ruthlessness, but now, the net was tightening. His empire was no longer a well-oiled machine, it was a ticking time bomb. The cartel had become a target for both law enforcement and rival drug organizations, and Escobar's hold over his men was weakening. The once unshakable alliances within the Medellín Cartel began to fracture. Even within his closest inner circle, loyalty started to waver. Some of Escobar's most trusted allies began to question their role in the empire, wondering how much longer they could continue to operate under his brutal regime. As Escobar's paranoia deepened, he became increasingly isolated, surrounded by a small group of loyal bodyguards who were just as committed to his survival as he was. But the truth was, the tide was turning against him. The government had started to form a more coordinated, focused effort to bring him down. The Colombian military, working alongside U.S. agencies, began to target key cartel members, weakening the Medellín Cartel from the inside out. The cartel's infrastructure, which had once been so vast and impenetrable, was starting to unravel. Despite his growing isolation and the mounting pressure, Escobar continued to fight. He even attempted to negotiate with the Colombian government, offering to surrender on the condition that he would be allowed to serve time in a prison of his own design. This so-called La Catedral prison, located in the mountains outside Medellín, was an extravagant fortress with luxury accommodations, complete with a helipad and a nightclub. Escobar's negotiations, however, were more about preserving his power than facing justice. He was willing to give up his freedom only as long as he could maintain control over his operations from inside prison. But the government, increasingly unwilling to tolerate his manipulations, soon realized that this agreement was merely a means for Escobar to buy time and maintain his grip on the cartel. The government's patience had worn thin, and the pressure to act was intensifying. The final years of Escobar's life were marked by a growing sense of futility. Despite his incredible wealth, power, and influence, he was being hunted like an animal. His empire, once the most formidable drug trafficking organization in the world, was now in disarray. Rivals, both within and outside of Colombia, were targeting him, hoping to take advantage of the chaos within the cartel. The Colombian government, with the assistance of the U.S. government, had finally begun to work in unison, putting a massive pressure on Escobar's network. The net around him was closing in. Escobar's attempts to escape his fate became more desperate. In his final months, he lived in hiding, constantly on the move, never staying in one place for too long. He had once been the ruler of an empire, able to dictate the terms of his survival. Now, he was a fugitive, hunted by the very forces he had once controlled. His old network of loyalists had begun to crumble, and he found himself increasingly alone, relying only on his most trusted bodyguards and a dwindling number of allies. Escobar's last days were marked by a profound sense of irony. The man who had once been untouchable, the king of the cocaine trade, had fallen into a state of desperation. He had once lived a life of luxury and violence, but now, as the walls closed in around him, he could only reflect on the choices that had led him to this point. His empire, built on blood and fear, had come crashing down. The government had finally caught up with him, and the forces of justice, long hindered by his influence and the weight of his wealth, were about to deliver the final blow. On December 2, 1993, the hunt for Pablo Escobar came to a dramatic end. As he tried to escape across the rooftops of Medellín, he was cornered by Colombian National Police. In the ensuing firefight, Escobar was killed. The king of the Medellín Cartel, the man who had once been the most feared and powerful criminal in the world, was dead. The fall of Escobar marked the end of an era, the collapse of a criminal empire that had once been untouchable. But while his life ended in violence, the legacy of Pablo Escobar lived on in the countless stories of destruction, betrayal, and bloodshed that marked the rise and fall of the Medellín Cartel. His death didn't signal the end of Colombia's drug wars or the eradication of drug cartels, rather, it symbolized the collapse of one of the most infamous criminal organizations in history. As the legend of Pablo Escobar began to unfold in the media, his life became a fascinating paradox, equal parts myth and reality. From humble beginnings in the rural towns of Colombia, Escobar had transcended his origins, growing into a figure whose power, wealth, and influence seemed otherworldly. In the span of just a few years, he had gone from a small-time smuggler to the head of the largest cocaine trafficking empire the world had ever seen. His rise to power was both audacious and calculating, and the way he expanded his reach throughout Colombia was a testament to his ruthless determination. Escobar's success wasn't just about violence and intimidation, it was also about his ability to manipulate people, politics, and power in a way that had never been seen before. His story was not just one of a drug lord, it was the story of a man who had mastered the art of domination. The appeal of Escobar, both within Colombia and internationally, was multifaceted. For many, he was a hero of the people, a man who had come from nothing and used his wealth to give back to his community. His efforts to build schools, hospitals, and housing for the poor in Medellín were well documented, and for a time, many saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood. Escobar's public image as a benefactor played a significant role in his ability to maintain power. By offering his support to the impoverished, he was able to build a loyal base of followers, many of whom were willing to protect him from law enforcement and rivals. His wealth allowed him to provide tangible benefits to the people, and in return, they viewed him as a man who had given them hope. Yet, this image was an illusion, one carefully cultivated by Escobar to serve his own interests. While he did indeed give back to his community, his actions were often self-serving. The public works projects he funded were not acts of charity, they were investments in loyalty. By providing for the poor, Escobar ensured that the people of Medellín would remain loyal to him, creating a buffer between him and the authorities. This relationship was built on fear, admiration, and, in some cases, genuine gratitude. For many of those living in poverty, Escobar offered them a taste of the wealth and power they could never have dreamed of, a way to escape the harsh realities of their lives. At the same time, Escobar's brutality was no less real. He was not simply a businessman looking to make money, he was a man who sought absolute control over every aspect of his empire, and he was willing to use violence to achieve that goal. His rise to power was marked by bloodshed, from assassinations to bombings. His tactics were ruthless, and he had no qualms about using terror to intimidate rivals and anyone who dared to challenge him. His reign was built on a foundation of fear, and the bodies piled up as a result. In Colombia, Escobar became synonymous with violence. His cartel didn't just control the drug trade, it controlled entire regions of the country, using terror to keep them under his thumb. Escobar's ability to influence the Colombian government played a crucial role in his success. By buying off politicians, police officers, and military leaders, Escobar effectively made himself untouchable. He had the power to control who was elected, who was arrested, and who was protected. For years, the Colombian government had been unable to effectively combat the growing drug cartels, and Escobar exploited this weakness to its fullest extent. He didn't just bribe officials, he manipulated the entire system, creating a web of corruption that reached into the highest offices in the country. He was so powerful that he was able to convince the government to grant him immunity from extradition to the United States, where the authorities were eager to capture him for his role in the cocaine trade. This immunity became a central point of contention between Escobar and the Colombian government. The U.S. government, which had long been engaged in a war on drugs, had placed Escobar at the top of its list of targets. The United States had seen the flow of cocaine into its borders increase exponentially during the 1980s, and Escobar's cartel was the primary supplier. For the U.S., eliminating Escobar was a top priority, and it placed immense pressure on the Colombian government to extradite him. But Escobar, ever the manipulator, used his vast wealth and influence to resist extradition. He was not about to allow himself to be taken to the United States, where he knew he would face a lengthy prison sentence. Escobar's refusal to face extradition led to a series of tense negotiations between the Colombian government, the United States, and Escobar himself. Escobar offered a deal to the Colombian government: he would surrender, but only if he could serve his sentence in a prison of his own making, one that would allow him to maintain control over his operations. This prison, known as La Catedral, was built in the mountains near Medellín, and it was more like a luxury compound than a traditional prison. It had a helipad, a nightclub, and even a soccer field. Escobar's idea of incarceration was not a life behind bars, it was a life where he could continue to run his empire from the comfort of his own home. The Colombian government, desperate to avoid a violent confrontation, agreed to the deal, allowing Escobar to remain in his self-made prison. However, Escobar's time in La Catedral was short-lived. Despite the privileges he enjoyed, he was not content with the arrangement. The authorities began to grow suspicious of the cartel's continued operations from within the prison walls, and Escobar's rivals began to sense an opportunity to bring him down. Escobar's continued ability to operate with impunity from inside his luxurious prison was untenable, and the government realized that they had been duped. Eventually, Escobar was moved to another facility, but not before he had solidified his place as one of the most dangerous criminals in history. By the time Escobar was moved from La Catedral, his empire was beginning to fracture. The pressure from the Colombian government, along with increased efforts by U.S. law enforcement agencies, was starting to take its toll on the Medellín Cartel. The cartel's operations were no longer as efficient as they had once been. Rival drug cartels, particularly the Cali cartel, began to rise in prominence, challenging Escobar's dominance in the cocaine trade. The Medellín Cartel was no longer the only game in town, and Escobar's hold on the industry was slipping. As the 1990s began, Escobar found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. His empire, once seemingly untouchable, was beginning to collapse around him. He had become a fugitive, constantly on the move, never staying in one place for too long. The Colombian authorities, with the assistance of U.S. law enforcement, began to close in on him. In his final months, Escobar lived in constant fear, unsure who to trust. The loyalty that had once been a hallmark of his cartel was now in question. His former allies had become potential traitors, and Escobar found himself increasingly isolated. The final chapter of Escobar's life would come not at the hands of his rivals, but from the very forces he had once been able to manipulate with ease. On December 2, 1993, after months of hiding, Pablo Escobar was finally cornered by Colombian police. The authorities had tracked him to a neighborhood in Medellín, and as Escobar attempted to escape by climbing onto the roofs of nearby houses, he was shot and killed in a firefight. His death marked the end of an era, the fall of one of the most powerful criminal empires in history. But even in death, Escobar's legacy lived on. The Medellín Cartel, though shattered by his demise, left an indelible mark on Colombia, the United States, and the world. Escobar's life became a symbol of the corrupting power of wealth, the lengths a man will go to for control, and the violence that can accompany unchecked ambition. The myth of Pablo Escobar, the man who built an empire on blood and fear, would continue to fascinate and horrify people for decades to come. His story became not just a cautionary tale, but a complex narrative of power, loss, and the eternal human struggle between ambition and consequence. The fall of Pablo Escobar was inevitable. It wasn't just the law that was closing in on him, it was the weight of his own empire, too vast, too corrupt, and too brutal to sustain itself forever. The Medellín Cartel, which had once seemed unstoppable, was beginning to disintegrate under the pressure. Escobar, the man who had crafted the cocaine empire, had built his kingdom with violence, manipulation, and an intricate web of connections, but those very things began to work against him as his enemies rallied. It was no longer just about business, this was a war for survival, and Escobar was caught in the crossfire of his own making. Escobar had always prided himself on his ability to control his surroundings, to manipulate situations in his favor. But as the years passed, the stakes had grown exponentially. His cartel, once a well-oiled machine of drug trafficking and money laundering, was beginning to show signs of internal disintegration. The pressure of constant violence, constant fear, and constant retaliation from the Colombian government, the United States, and rival cartels had taken its toll. Escobar's network of loyalists, once rock solid, was starting to show fractures, as more and more members of his organization began to question their loyalty to a man whose reign of terror was starting to come undone. At the same time, Escobar's ever-growing paranoia pushed him to make decisions that would only exacerbate the situation. He had always been a master of manipulation, playing people against each other and forcing them to do his bidding. But the enemies closing in on him were not so easily controlled. The Colombian government had started to coordinate with U.S. law enforcement agencies, deploying a relentless strategy to bring Escobar down. They had learned from the mistakes of the past, Escobar had outwitted them for years, but now they were prepared to track him at every step. The American government, desperate to stem the flow of cocaine into its streets, intensified its efforts, using everything at its disposal, from intelligence networks to military assistance, to track and dismantle the Medellín Cartel. The situation was made even worse by the rivalries within Colombia itself. The Cali Cartel, a growing force in the cocaine trade, had long been in competition with Escobar. While the Medellín Cartel had been known for its brazen violence and relentless power, the Cali Cartel was far more subtle, a sophisticated organization that had managed to stay under the radar while expanding its own reach. As Escobar's empire weakened, the Cali Cartel moved in, seizing key territories and markets that had once been firmly under Escobar's control. Rival cartels were not the only threat, though. The local population, long subjected to the brutal rule of Escobar's empire, had begun to turn against him. While he had once been seen as a hero by the poor in Medellín, this image had gradually eroded as the violence escalated. As Escobar's empire became synonymous with terror, the public sentiment began to shift. Even some of his former supporters, those he had helped build homes, schools, and hospitals for, began to question his motives. Escobar's ever-expanding paranoia played a crucial role in his downfall. The same man who had ruled Colombia with an iron fist, who had brought the government to its knees through bribes and intimidation, was now increasingly isolated. In his mind, everyone had become a potential threat. His inner circle, once composed of loyalists and trusted allies, began to fracture under the stress of the ongoing war. Some of his closest associates, including those who had worked for him since the early days of his rise to power, began to fear for their own safety and their families. They saw that the government and the rival cartels were no longer just making moves to eliminate Escobar, they were closing in on the very heart of his operation. As the noose tightened, some of his most trusted lieutenants started to defect, giving up information that would lead to Escobar's eventual demise. This betrayal became the catalyst for his final downfall. Escobar, who had once been able to manipulate everyone around him, found that the tables had turned. His enemies, both inside and outside his organization, had started to work together, and the web of alliances and betrayals grew ever more complex. The Colombian government, now with the full backing of the United States, had formed an elite task force, the Search Bloc, tasked with capturing Escobar. These men were trained to hunt down the most dangerous criminals in Colombia, and they were focused on one goal: to bring Pablo Escobar to justice. Despite his desperation and the mounting pressure, Escobar continued to fight back with everything he had. In his mind, there was no other choice. He could not afford to lose. He was too powerful, too dangerous, and too determined to allow himself to be captured. But in the final months of his life, Escobar was running out of options. His vast wealth, his connections, and his tactical brilliance had served him well for years, but they could not protect him from the combined might of the Colombian government and the U.S. military. Escobar's hideouts, once filled with luxury and the trappings of his empire, had become little more than cramped, temporary shelters. He moved from one safe house to the next, never staying in one place for too long. His once thriving empire had become a fragile network of shadows and whispers, a far cry from the powerful organization that had once controlled the flow of cocaine into the United States. Escobar's final attempt to negotiate with the Colombian government was nothing short of desperate. He offered to surrender in exchange for guarantees of safety, but the government was no longer willing to make deals. Escobar's reign of terror had gone on for too long, and they could no longer afford to show him any mercy. The situation had reached a boiling point. Escobar had no choice but to continue running, but he was increasingly aware that time was running out. It was no longer a question of if he would be captured, it was a question of when. The final confrontation came in December of 1993. After months of hiding and evading capture, Escobar was located in a neighborhood in Medellín. The search had intensified, and the Colombian National Police, with the help of the U.S. government, had finally cornered the once untouchable drug lord. In a desperate bid for survival, Escobar attempted to escape through the rooftops, but the police were closing in. The tension in the air was palpable as the standoff came to its tragic conclusion. Escobar, who had once been the most powerful man in Colombia, was now a hunted fugitive, surrounded by enemies on all sides. In a firefight that lasted mere minutes, Pablo Escobar was shot and killed. His death marked the end of an era in Colombia's war on drugs. The Medellín Cartel, once a sprawling empire that had reigned supreme over the cocaine trade, was now a shadow of its former self. With Escobar's death, the cartel's operations came to a screeching halt. The power vacuum that followed led to a fierce struggle for control, with rival cartels, including the Cali cartel, fighting for supremacy. However, the Medellín Cartel could never reclaim the dominance it once held, and the criminal organization that had been the scourge of Colombia for years was effectively dismantled. Escobar's death was a momentous occasion, but it did not bring an end to the violence and chaos that had plagued Colombia. The legacy of the drug trade lived on, and new players quickly emerged to fill the void left by the Medellín Cartel. Yet, for many in Colombia, the death of Pablo Escobar represented a turning point. It was the moment when the country could finally begin to heal from the scars left by his reign of terror. But Escobar's legacy, as both a criminal mastermind and a controversial figure in Colombian history, would continue to haunt the country for years to come. Even in death, Pablo Escobar remained a figure of fascination. His story became the stuff of legend, a tale of power, greed, and ultimate destruction. To this day, Escobar's name is synonymous with the global drug trade and the extreme lengths to which people will go to achieve power. His rise and fall serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the destructive force of criminal empires. And while his empire may have fallen, the echoes of his influence continue to reverberate through the world of organized crime. The fall of the Medellín Cartel was not just the end of an era for Colombia, it was the beginning of an entirely new chapter in the history of global crime. When Pablo Escobar died in December of 1993, his death marked the fall of one of the most notorious empires the world had ever seen. But while Escobar's reign had ended, the legacy of his actions and the remnants of his criminal empire lingered. In many ways, his death did not close the book on the Medellín Cartel, it only set the stage for a more chaotic, fragmented, and dangerous phase in the Colombian drug trade. Escobar's death, while monumental, didn't bring about the immediate collapse of the Medellín Cartel. Instead, it unleashed a power vacuum, and what followed was a brutal struggle for dominance in Colombia's criminal underworld. The cartel's infrastructure was severely damaged by the loss of its charismatic leader, but the machinery of drug trafficking was too vast and intricate to disappear overnight. With Escobar gone, former allies and rivals alike scrambled to claim control of the lucrative cocaine trade. The violent power struggles that ensued became the defining feature of the years that followed. One of the primary forces that rose to challenge the remnants of the Medellín Cartel was the Cali Cartel. Where Escobar had been loud, brash, and ruthless, the Cali Cartel was more calculated and secretive. The Cali Cartel, led by the Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers, had been Escobar's main competitor for years. Though they had operated more discreetly, they had always been a formidable force in the cocaine trade. With the fall of the Medellín Cartel, the Cali Cartel stepped in to take control of the global cocaine market. They quickly expanded their operations, solidifying their grip on Colombia's drug trade and taking over many of the routes and markets once controlled by Escobar's men. However, the rise of the Cali Cartel did not bring stability to Colombia. Instead, it led to a period of even greater violence and fragmentation. As the Cali Cartel expanded its influence, it faced significant resistance from rival cartels, paramilitary groups, and even the Colombian government. The once united front of the Medellín Cartel had fractured, leaving behind a patchwork of violent, competing factions. Colombia, already reeling from the damage caused by Escobar's reign, found itself plunged back into chaos. The battle for control over drug routes, territories, and markets became even more deadly, with rival groups constantly vying for dominance. In many cases, the line between the government and the cartels became blurred, as corrupt officials and law enforcement officers continued to support the cartels in exchange for bribes. The death of Escobar also marked a turning point in the U.S. war on drugs. Escobar had been the focal point of American efforts to stop the flow of cocaine into the United States, but even after his death, the drug trade did not cease. While Escobar's personal empire crumbled, the demand for cocaine remained high, and the global drug trade continued to thrive. The U.S. government, while celebrating Escobar's demise, quickly realized that his death was not the panacea they had hoped for. Instead, it became clear that the problem was far more complex than the fall of a single kingpin. The U.S. found itself dealing with a much more fragmented and decentralized drug trade, one that was harder to target and dismantle. In Colombia, Escobar's legacy lingered long after his death. The public perception of Escobar had always been a complex one. He was a ruthless drug lord, but he was also seen by some as a kind of folk hero. His charity work, particularly in the barrios of Medellín, had earned him a loyal following. People remembered how Escobar had funded the construction of houses, hospitals, and soccer fields, providing a much-needed sense of hope in areas where the government had failed to provide. But as the violence of the drug trade continued, that image began to fade. The destruction Escobar had wrought, through bombings, assassinations, and his near-total control of the Colombian government, left a deep scar in the country's history. The memory of the thousands of lives lost in his wake lingered long after his death, and the pain he had caused would not soon be forgotten. For years after his death, Escobar remained a controversial figure in Colombia. His name became synonymous with the brutal legacy of the Medellín Cartel and the catastrophic consequences of the global drug trade. The Colombian government, despite its best efforts to rebuild the country after Escobar's reign, struggled to undo the damage he had done. While efforts to combat drug cartels continued, the underlying problems, poverty, inequality, and government corruption, remained unresolved. The people who had once supported Escobar out of gratitude or fear were now left with the aftermath of his violence, and the country was left to reckon with the moral and political implications of his empire. Escobar's death also had far-reaching effects on the international drug trade. While the Cali cartel stepped in to fill the power vacuum, the fragmentation of the drug trade meant that no single organization could dominate in the same way Escobar had. Multiple smaller cartels and syndicates took over various parts of the cocaine distribution chain, making the trade even more difficult to track and combat. The drug trade became more decentralized, with smaller, more agile organizations constantly shifting their methods and routes. While some cartels in Colombia, Mexico, and the Caribbean would rise to prominence, none would replicate the scale or power of the Medellín Cartel under Escobar's leadership. The media's fascination with Escobar only deepened after his death. In the years following his demise, the world's fascination with his life and criminal empire grew. Books, documentaries, and movies were made about his rise and fall, cementing his status as one of the most infamous criminals in history. For many, Escobar's story became a kind of myth, a tale of ambition, violence, and the pursuit of power that seemed almost larger than life. The global fascination with Escobar transformed him into a pop culture icon, despite the tremendous suffering he caused. In Colombia, however, the reality of his reign was far from glamorous. His death may have ended his personal rule, but it did not erase the scars he left on the country. For many Colombians, Escobar was a reminder of the country's painful past, a past that was still being felt in the present. In the years following his death, Escobar's family also found themselves living in the shadows of his legacy. His wife, Maria Victoria Henao, and their two children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, were forced into hiding. After Escobar's death, the family was left with little more than the massive fortune he had accumulated, which was now under heavy scrutiny. The Colombian government, as well as the U.S. authorities, sought to seize as much of his wealth as possible, but much of it was hidden or laundered. The family was forced to flee Colombia and start over in a new country, living under new identities. For his children, the burden of being the offspring of one of the most notorious criminals in history would follow them for the rest of their lives. The effects of Escobar's empire extended far beyond Colombia. The drug trade he pioneered had global implications, touching everything from law enforcement strategies to international relations. The U.S. government, which had spent decades battling Escobar's cartel, was forced to reevaluate its approach to the war on drugs. The failures and complexities of fighting the cartel under Escobar's leadership showed that the drug problem was far from being solved by simply eliminating one criminal mastermind. Instead, the U.S. turned its focus to broader, systemic issues, including efforts to reduce demand for drugs, enhance international cooperation, and work on preventing the rise of future cartels. Escobar's life and death would become a haunting reflection of the complexities of power, greed, and violence. While his death marked the end of his empire, the consequences of his rise to power and the damage he had caused would be felt for decades to come. The shadows of the Medellín Cartel stretched far beyond the borders of Colombia, leaving an indelible mark on the global drug trade and law enforcement tactics worldwide. Though Escobar was dead, the world had learned that the fight against the drug trade was far from over, and the road to dismantling the global narcotics network would be a long and difficult one. His legacy, whether in myth or in truth, served as a reminder that the pursuit of wealth and power through violence and fear leaves behind nothing but destruction. The death of Pablo Escobar in 1993 marked not only the demise of a man but the unraveling of an entire empire that had thrived on bloodshed, corruption, and fear. While Colombia, and indeed much of the world, might have hoped that his passing would signify an end to the chaos he had unleashed, the aftermath of his death told a far different story. In truth, Escobar's influence lingered long after his body had been laid to rest. His empire, built on the global cocaine trade, continued to leave ripples in the criminal world. His death did not automatically wipe away the lasting effects of his reign. In fact, it opened the doors to new struggles, new players, and an even more violent chapter in the history of Colombian drug cartels. With Escobar's passing, the Medellín Cartel, the once mighty force that had controlled vast portions of the cocaine trade in South America, began to fall apart. However, like any power vacuum, the collapse of Escobar's reign did not lead to immediate peace. Instead, it created a struggle for dominance, both within Colombia and across the globe, as rival cartels rushed in to claim control of Escobar's former empire. The most significant of these was the Cali Cartel, a sophisticated organization that had long been Escobar's rival, though it had operated more covertly and with less of the spectacle and violence that had defined Escobar's methods. The Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers, the leaders of the Cali Cartel, saw an opportunity to expand their reach now that the Medellín Cartel was fractured. The Cali Cartel's rise after Escobar's death was strategic and deliberate. They had always been more discreet in their operations than Escobar, preferring to keep a lower profile while quietly amassing power. Their operations were marked by a highly organized structure and a preference for bribery over outright violence. With Escobar gone, the Cali Cartel seized control of the cocaine trade that had once been Escobar's crown jewel. They capitalized on the chaotic vacuum left behind by the Medellín Cartel and expanded their grip on global cocaine markets. While Escobar's methods had often been loud, terrifying, and ruthlessly violent, the Cali Cartel employed a more businesslike approach, controlling key drug routes while avoiding direct confrontations with the Colombian government. This approach allowed them to operate more efficiently and, for a time, more successfully than Escobar ever had. However, even the Cali Cartel's rise was not without its challenges. The brutal history of Escobar's reign meant that Colombia had been irrevocably scarred by the violence and corruption that had been ingrained in the fabric of the country's political and social structures. The government of Colombia had already been compromised by decades of bribery, and while the death of Escobar temporarily weakened the cartel's influence, it also left a political and criminal landscape rife with instability. Escobar's violent empire had created an environment where rival groups were constantly at war, where corruption ran deep, and where the line between the state and the drug cartels was often blurred. In the immediate aftermath of Escobar's death, the Colombian government, along with the United States, focused on dismantling the remaining elements of the Medellín Cartel, even though Escobar's personal empire had collapsed. The Search Bloc, a special task force created to hunt down Escobar, now turned its attention to his loyalists and remaining cartel members. But the cartel was already splintering into smaller factions, each led by former associates of Escobar who were eager to continue their own drug operations. The dismantling of the Medellín Cartel wasn't a single moment, it was an ongoing process, and much of its influence and wealth had already been dispersed to rival groups. Even as law enforcement began to take down the remnants of Escobar's operations, the splintered forces within the cartels, now more divided, presented a much more complicated network of organized crime to contend with. One of the most notable effects of Escobar's death was the expansion of Mexico's role in the global drug trade. With the Colombian cartels in disarray, Mexican drug trafficking organizations, many of which had been operating under the radar for years, began to fill the void left behind. Cartels like the Sinaloa and the Gulf cartels saw an opportunity to expand their reach into U.S. markets and take control of smuggling routes that had once been under Escobar's control. Mexico had long been a key player in the transportation of drugs across the U.S.-Mexico border, but Escobar's fall accelerated the Mexican cartel's rise to power. As the Colombian government, aided by U.S. forces, attempted to bring stability to the country, it faced an even more complex task than ever before. The legacy of Escobar's actions, his violence, his ability to corrupt entire systems, and his sheer capacity for cruelty, had created a criminal world that was deeply entrenched. Even with Escobar gone, Colombia's battle with its cartels was far from over. The government was forced to deal with not just one dominant cartel but multiple groups that were vying for power. The battle against the cartels became a fractured war, one that could not be won by dismantling just a single criminal organization. Meanwhile, Escobar's name continued to haunt Colombia and the world. In Medellín, where Escobar had once held sway, the memory of his power and violence remained a painful and complex subject. Some viewed him as a necessary evil, a man who, despite his crimes, had provided for the people in ways the government had failed to do. The buildings he funded, the hospitals he established, the homes he built for the poor, became symbols of his complicated legacy. For the people of Medellín who had benefited from his generosity, Escobar's death did not bring about a simple sense of closure. Many still remembered him as the man who gave them jobs and homes in a country where they had little. But for others, Escobar's death marked the end of a reign of terror that had blighted the country for years. Escobar was both a villain and, in the eyes of many, a hero, a symbol of the conflict and contradictions that defined Colombia's turbulent history. Beyond Colombia, Escobar's death had global implications. The U.S. had long viewed him as the face of the international drug trade, and with his death, it hoped to mark a victory in the war on drugs. However, the truth was far less satisfying. While the U.S. celebrated Escobar's demise, the global cocaine trade did not end with him. His death had simply redistributed the flow of narcotics to new cartels, many of which operated with far more caution and sophistication. The U.S. government quickly realized that the problem of drug trafficking was not confined to one individual or one cartel. As Escobar's network fragmented, the international drug trade became even more decentralized, and law enforcement faced greater challenges. Escobar's death might have symbolized a victory over one of the world's most infamous criminals, but it also highlighted the inherent limitations of the U.S. war on drugs. Escobar's family, too, became casualties of his legacy. After his death, his wife, Maria Victoria Henao, and their two children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, were forced to live under false identities, constantly in hiding. The family's wealth, much of which had been amassed from the proceeds of drug trafficking, was scrutinized by both Colombian and U.S. authorities. They were left with little more than the memories of their patriarch's brutal legacy, trying to rebuild their lives in the shadows. For Escobar's children, the burden of being associated with one of the most notorious criminals in history would follow them for the rest of their lives. Despite their attempts to distance themselves from their father's actions, the world would always remember the name Escobar as synonymous with the global cocaine trade. The aftermath of Escobar's death also saw a shift in the way the Colombian government approached the drug trade. Escobar's empire had been built on a system of corruption that extended far into the upper echelons of Colombian politics. Even after his death, the effects of this corruption persisted. The battle against the cartels, while ongoing, would always be affected by the legacy of Escobar's manipulation of the political system. The government's ability to truly dismantle the cartels was hampered by deep-seated corruption, and many officials who had once turned a blind eye to Escobar's empire continued to operate under the radar, supporting the new generation of drug lords. The death of Pablo Escobar did not signal the end of the war on drugs or the end of Colombia's struggles with its criminal cartels. His death was, in many ways, merely a chapter in a much larger, more complex story. While Escobar's physical presence was gone, the consequences of his actions remained. His empire, his network of corruption, and his violent legacy continued to shape the landscape of global drug trafficking for years to come. The death of Pablo Escobar in 1993 marked the fall of a titan, but the shadow of his empire still loomed large, both within Colombia and around the globe. The absence of its powerful leader sent ripples through the criminal underworld, and as the Colombian government and law enforcement agencies scrambled to fill the void left behind, new challenges began to emerge. Escobar's death did not mark the end of the cocaine trade, rather, it triggered a shift in the power dynamics of the drug world, leading to the rise of new players, new cartels, and a more complex battle for dominance. The story of Escobar's empire, though officially concluded with his demise, continued to unfold in a new, fragmented form, both in Colombia and internationally. After Escobar's death, the Medellín Cartel did not simply disband. Instead, it fractured into multiple factions, each attempting to maintain control over different parts of the cocaine trade. While the cartel had been synonymous with Escobar's brutality, it had also been a well-oiled machine of drug trafficking that had spanned multiple continents. With his death, the remaining members of the cartel, once loyal to the kingpin, were left scrambling to salvage what they could from the wreckage. Some of them sought to operate independently, while others attempted to align themselves with rival cartels in a bid for survival. The most significant rival to the Medellín cartel's remnants was the Cali cartel, which had always operated more covertly than Escobar's empire. The Cali cartel, led by the Rodriguez Orihuela brothers, had managed to stay largely out of the public eye while still amassing considerable wealth and influence. Unlike Escobar, who had used violence and intimidation to carve out his territory, the Cali cartel preferred a more business-oriented approach. They were methodical, less prone to spectacle, and more capable of forming alliances with key players in the political and law enforcement sectors. This strategic approach allowed them to gain a significant foothold in the post-Escobar world. The power vacuum left by Escobar's death was not immediately filled by the Cali cartel, but their rise to dominance was a gradual and calculated process. They expanded their operations by taking control of drug trafficking routes and smuggling corridors that had previously been the domain of the Medellín Cartel. The Cali cartel quickly began to dominate the global cocaine trade, establishing themselves as the new kings of the industry. However, their rise was not without challenges. The Colombian government, still reeling from the damage caused by Escobar's reign, turned its focus to dismantling the remnants of the Medellín cartel and addressing the growing power of the Cali cartel. The search for Escobar's former associates continued, but the landscape had shifted. The Colombian government, aided by the United States, now had to contend with a more sophisticated and elusive criminal organization. In the years following Escobar's death, the Colombian government began to focus its efforts on eradicating the cartels once and for all. But the challenges were monumental. While the fall of Escobar's empire was a significant victory, it was far from the end of Colombia's struggles with drug trafficking. The Colombian government, despite its best efforts, was often hamstrung by corruption, inadequate resources, and the deep-rooted influence of the cartels. The war on drugs had become more than just a battle against individual criminal organizations, it was a systemic problem that permeated the fabric of Colombian society. The line between the state and the cartels had often been blurred, with cartels wielding influence over politicians, law enforcement, and even the military. The Colombian government's attempts to fight back were often undercut by the very system it was trying to protect. Meanwhile, Escobar's death had broader implications beyond Colombia's borders. The United States, which had long been a primary target of the Medellín cartel's cocaine exports, was quick to claim victory in the fight against Escobar. His death was seen as a significant blow to the global drug trade, and the U.S. government hoped it would stem the flow of cocaine into its streets. However, the U.S. soon realized that Escobar's death did not signal the end of the cocaine trade. Instead, it exposed the decentralized nature of the drug trade and the complexity of dismantling criminal organizations that operated across borders. The demand for cocaine in the United States remained high, and new cartels began to rise in the void left by Escobar. One of the key changes in the global drug trade following Escobar's death was the increased role of Mexico. The Mexican cartels, which had been involved in the transportation of drugs to the United States, quickly filled the power vacuum left by the Colombian cartels. The Sinaloa cartel, in particular, began to emerge as a dominant force in the drug trade, while other Mexican cartels such as the Gulf Cartel and the Juarez Cartel also expanded their operations. These Mexican cartels, in many ways, were better positioned to take over the cocaine trade. They were more adaptable, with more extensive networks across both Colombia and Mexico, and they were increasingly adept at navigating the challenges posed by law enforcement and rival cartels. With their foothold in both Colombia and the U.S., they could more easily control the flow of drugs into North America. While the Mexican cartels rose to prominence in the wake of Escobar's death, Colombia remained a key player in the drug trade. The country's mountainous terrain, with its numerous remote locations and hidden paths, remained ideal for cultivating coca plants and processing cocaine. Despite the ongoing efforts to eradicate coca cultivation, Colombia continued to be one of the largest suppliers of cocaine in the world. Even with the fall of the Medellín cartel, Colombia's role in the global drug trade remained as significant as ever. This paradox, the country's efforts to rid itself of the scourge of drug cartels while simultaneously remaining a key supplier of narcotics, was one of the lingering legacies of Escobar's reign. Escobar's death also had a lasting impact on the people of Colombia. His brutal rule had left an indelible mark on the country's psyche. While some people continued to view him as a figure who had helped the poor and built infrastructure, the violence and instability he had wrought were undeniable. Thousands of lives had been lost during his reign, and the scars left by his bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings would take years to heal. The trauma of Escobar's reign was not just felt in Colombia, it was also felt in the United States and other countries that had been affected by his drug trade. The global impact of his empire, which spanned continents and affected millions of lives, could not be easily undone. The complexity of Escobar's legacy is reflected in the way his death reshaped the world of organized crime. The fight for dominance over the global cocaine trade did not end with his passing, rather, it evolved. As the cartels fractured and new players entered the field, the nature of the drug trade became more fragmented and decentralized. No longer was there a single, dominant cartel that controlled everything. Instead, the cocaine market became a patchwork of competing factions, each with its own strategies, alliances, and areas of influence. While some cartels, such as the Cali cartel, expanded their power, others, like the Mexican cartels, quickly took advantage of the opening and became dominant forces in the drug trade. Escobar's death also marked a significant turning point in the relationship between Colombia and the United States. The two countries had worked together closely in the fight against Escobar, with the U.S. providing resources and support to the Colombian government in its efforts to capture him. But Escobar's death didn't signify the end of the fight against drugs. The U.S. continued to send resources to Colombia, focusing on the broader war on drugs and the eradication of coca cultivation. However, the continuing influence of the cartels and the inability of the Colombian government to fully dismantle the drug trade meant that the war on drugs remained a long and difficult struggle. In the years following Escobar's death, Colombia would continue to battle the remnants of his empire, but the true effects of his reign would never fully fade. Escobar's name would remain a symbol of both power and destruction for years to come. His life, his empire, and his death would serve as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, the far-reaching consequences of the drug trade, and the complex legacy left by one of the world's most infamous criminals. The fall of Pablo Escobar and the Medellín Cartel did not mark the end of Colombia's tumultuous history with drug trafficking, nor did it bring a swift return to peace and stability. Instead, it heralded a new era of fragmented violence, shifting allegiances, and continued drug trade dominance. As the Colombian government, with heavy support from the United States, dismantled Escobar's empire, it became clear that the war against drugs was far more complex than any one cartel or criminal mastermind. Though Escobar was dead, the world had learned that there would always be more players vying for control over the drug trade, and each one would bring new challenges, corruption, and violence. One of the most profound shifts after Escobar's death was the rapid rise of Mexico's drug cartels. Though Mexican cartels had long been players in the drug trade, primarily focused on trafficking cocaine, marijuana, and other illicit substances into the U.S., Escobar's death provided them with a unique opportunity to fill the power vacuum left by the Medellín Cartel. As Colombian cartels fractured and splintered in the wake of Escobar's demise, Mexican cartels such as the Sinaloa, Gulf, and Juarez cartels became dominant forces in both the production and distribution of cocaine. These Mexican organizations were often better equipped and more adaptable than their Colombian predecessors. They had already established crucial smuggling routes through Central America, and their experience in trafficking narcotics made them well positioned to seize control of the cocaine supply chain. At first, the Colombian government and U.S. law enforcement believed that the destruction of the Medellín cartel, the capture of its leaders, and the elimination of Escobar would signal the collapse of the cocaine trade. However, what followed was a fragmented, decentralized narcotics network that became even harder to target. With no singular cartel to focus on, the drug trade splintered into multiple factions, each competing for its own piece of the pie. Escobar's departure may have ended his rule, but it inadvertently paved the way for a more disorganized, diffuse structure of drug cartels, which proved much more difficult to eradicate. The continued demand for cocaine in the United States and Europe remained a driving force in the ongoing violence. Even after Escobar's death, drug cartels continued to smuggle cocaine into the U.S., where it remained in high demand. While Escobar had controlled vast portions of the supply, his absence created room for new and equally ruthless organizations to enter the fray. The Sinaloa Cartel, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, quickly rose to prominence in Mexico, becoming one of the most powerful and influential cartels in the world. Unlike Escobar, who relied on brute force, Guzman employed a more subtle approach, often using bribery and coercion to ensure the smooth operation of his empire. Over time, Guzman's Sinaloa cartel became a central figure in the cocaine trade, and its reach expanded throughout Latin America, eventually creating a new center of power in global narcotics trafficking. Despite the fragmentation of the Colombian cartels, many of Escobar's former associates and loyalists continued to operate, albeit under different banners. Some members of the Medellín Cartel formed alliances with the Cali Cartel, which, after Escobar's death, quickly became the dominant force in Colombia. The Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers, leaders of the Cali Cartel, capitalized on Escobar's fall, consolidating their power and expanding their operations. While they did not share Escobar's love for violence, the Cali Cartel employed a similar strategy of manipulation and bribery, often involving high-level political and law enforcement figures. The smooth, business-like operation of the Cali Cartel contrasted sharply with the chaos and brutality of the Medellín Cartel, but it was still very much entrenched in the same illicit business model. The Colombian government, despite its initial victory in capturing Escobar and breaking apart his cartel, quickly realized that the fight against drug trafficking had only just begun. In fact, the war against drugs seemed to be escalating rather than abating. The state continued to deal with violence as rival cartels, paramilitary groups, and even the remnants of the Medellín cartel fought over control of the cocaine trade. The fear, intimidation, and corruption that had defined Escobar's reign were far from gone. Political and social instability persisted, and many regions of Colombia, especially the rural areas, remained in the grip of violence. Colombia's struggle was not just with the drug cartels, it was with a system that had allowed such organizations to flourish in the first place. The United States, too, had an increasingly complex relationship with Colombia in the aftermath of Escobar's death. While Escobar's demise was hailed as a significant victory in the war on drugs, the reality of the situation was much more sobering. As Mexican cartels surged in power, U.S. law enforcement found themselves facing a new set of challenges. The fight against drug cartels was no longer focused on one country or one criminal organization. It was a far-reaching, transnational problem that required international cooperation on an unprecedented scale. The U.S. began to pour more resources into Mexico and Colombia, focusing not only on dismantling cartels but also on addressing the underlying economic, political, and social factors that made the drug trade so resilient. The global response to the drug trade also took on new dimensions after Escobar's death. Countries all over Latin America, and particularly those involved in the drug production process, began to reconsider their strategies for combating drug cartels. While some countries, like Mexico, took more aggressive measures against drug cartels, others, like Colombia, recognized the need for a more nuanced approach. With Escobar's death, Colombia began to shift away from the heavy reliance on military force and toward more targeted, intelligence-based operations to combat drug trafficking. This shift marked a change in the way drug cartels were dealt with, focusing less on outright warfare and more on disruption, arresting high-ranking cartel members, and cutting off the flow of drugs at key choke points. While these new strategies saw some success, the political and economic turmoil in Colombia, as well as the persistent demand for drugs in the U.S. and beyond, meant that Colombia remained a key battleground in the fight against the global drug trade. Escobar's death had not erased the systemic issues that allowed drug cartels to thrive, and the country continued to face the fallout of decades of violence, corruption, and impunity. The economic disparity and lack of opportunities that had enabled Escobar to rise to power were still very much present in Colombia's poorest regions. For many, the promise of wealth from the drug trade remained too tempting to resist, and the cycle of violence and corruption continued. In the years following Escobar's death, Colombia's national psyche was deeply impacted by the events of the 1980s and 1990s. The nation had experienced a level of violence and political instability that most countries could never imagine. The scars of Escobar's empire were etched into the landscape, into the memories of those who lived through the reign of terror, and into the fabric of Colombian society. While Escobar's death symbolized the end of an era, the country had to face the reality that his legacy would remain inextricably tied to the history of Colombia's fight against drugs and organized crime. As the years passed, Escobar's story took on mythic proportions. His name became synonymous with both the allure and the danger of the drug trade, and his life inspired countless documentaries, books, and films. His personal life, his family, his immense wealth, and his ultimate demise continued to capture the world's imagination. But for the people of Colombia, the myth was tempered by the painful realities of the destruction that had been wrought during his reign. Many remembered the destruction of Medellín, the bombings, the assassinations, and the people whose lives were permanently altered by Escobar's violence. Even though the Colombian government continued its efforts to recover from the damage caused by Escobar's reign, the country's history was forever shaped by his empire. The years after his death saw new challenges emerge, but the fundamental issues that had allowed the cartel to thrive remained. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement and politicians, the drug trade continued to flourish in a country where poverty, corruption, and inequality remained entrenched. And though Escobar was gone, his legacy lingered in the undercurrents of Colombian society, in the global drug trade, and in the lives of those who were affected by the rise and fall of his empire. In the end, the death of Pablo Escobar was not the conclusion of the drug war, but a new beginning, a new chapter in an ongoing struggle that would continue to evolve and transform in unexpected ways. The fallout from Pablo Escobar's death was felt on an international scale, but it was in Colombia that the reverberations were most intense. While Escobar's reign had officially come to an end, the drug trade he pioneered did not vanish with him. His death left a gaping hole, not just within the Medellín Cartel but in the entire structure of global narcotics trafficking. The hope that his demise would signal the end of Colombia's drug war was short-lived. Instead, the country's drug cartels splintered, and while Escobar was gone, his empire had created a vacuum that multiple new forces scrambled to fill. The battle for dominance that followed became a harrowing and violent chapter in Colombia's history, one that marked the beginning of a new era of fragmentation and disarray. In the wake of Escobar's death, the Colombian government began to aggressively dismantle the remnants of the Medellín Cartel. But the complexity of the drug trade, combined with the remaining power structures built by Escobar, meant that efforts to remove the drug cartels could not simply be reduced to eliminating one man or one organization. Instead, the remnants of Escobar's empire fractured into smaller factions that continued their criminal activities. These factions, many of them consisting of former associates, didn't just collapse, they regrouped, reorganized, and fought to retain control over lucrative cocaine routes. With Colombia no longer dominated by one central force, the drug trade became more decentralized and harder to target. Former Medellín cartel members, once loyal to Escobar, now either competed with one another or aligned themselves with new criminal organizations, some of which were more dangerous and elusive than Escobar's network had been. The most notable competitor for the remaining control of the Colombian cocaine trade was the Cali Cartel, a rival drug syndicate that had, until Escobar's downfall, played a quieter but equally influential role in Colombia's criminal landscape. The Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers, who led the Cali Cartel, had long operated in the shadows while Escobar and the Medellín Cartel garnered the bulk of the media attention. The Cali Cartel had grown powerful over the years, though their strategy had always been more discreet. While Escobar engaged in flashy, high-profile violence and terror, the Cali Cartel's methods were far more subtle and strategic. The brothers were not as overtly violent as Escobar, preferring bribery, political manipulation, and clandestine operations to solidify their power. With Escobar's death, the Cali Cartel capitalized on the situation, gradually taking control of the cocaine market that had once been Escobar's domain. The transition from the Medellín Cartel to the Cali Cartel was not smooth. Escobar's death triggered a period of intense violence, not only between rival cartels but also within them. As the remnants of the Medellín Cartel splintered, each faction fought for its own survival. The ruthless power struggles among these groups created a highly unstable situation, with new players entering the field and old ones refusing to relinquish their hold on the lucrative trade. The chaotic environment in Colombia became a breeding ground for criminal organizations of all sizes. While the Cali cartel slowly expanded its operations, taking over key drug smuggling routes and establishing a more professional and sophisticated empire, it wasn't long before the Colombian government realized that it was fighting a war against many factions, not just a single enemy. The Colombian government, although strengthened by its efforts to bring down Escobar, found itself increasingly overwhelmed by the new structure of the drug trade. Colombia's government agencies had been rocked by corruption during Escobar's reign, and even after his death, those issues didn't disappear. Cartels, including the remnants of the Medellín Cartel and the increasingly powerful Cali cartel, continued to bribe politicians and law enforcement officials. This widespread corruption severely hampered the government's ability to effectively combat the growing number of criminal organizations. Furthermore, the complexity of the drug trade, coupled with the lack of resources to fully address the issue, meant that the Colombian government's fight against narco-trafficking was far from over. While Escobar had been the face of Colombia's cocaine empire, the country still faced an immense challenge in dismantling the vast networks of organized crime that he had helped to establish. For the United States, Escobar's death was hailed as a significant victory in the war on drugs, but the reality was far less satisfying. U.S. authorities had long seen Escobar as the central figure in the Colombian cocaine trade, and his death was celebrated as a blow to the international drug trade. But as it became apparent, Escobar's death did not end the flow of cocaine into the U.S., or solve the larger problem of the drug trade. With the Cali cartel assuming control of much of the trade, the U.S. found itself dealing with an even more complex network of drug traffickers. The problem was no longer confined to Colombia. Mexican cartels, who had previously operated as suppliers for Colombian cocaine, now became key players in the production, transportation, and distribution of narcotics. The fragmentation of the cocaine trade meant that law enforcement agencies across the globe now faced a multi-headed monster, far more difficult to combat than the Medellín cartel under Escobar. The U.S. government strategy in Colombia underwent a shift in the years following Escobar's death. Initially, the U.S. had poured considerable resources into tracking down and neutralizing Escobar, but after his death, the focus moved toward curbing the growing influence of the Cali cartel and other emerging criminal organizations. The U.S. continued to support Colombian efforts, sending financial and intelligence resources to help dismantle the cartels, but it soon became clear that a purely military approach would not work in this new phase of the drug war. As the cartels diversified, U.S. authorities found themselves increasingly engaged in international operations, collaborating with Mexico and other Latin American countries to tackle the cross-border trafficking networks. The rise of Mexican cartels further complicated matters. The Sinaloa cartel, in particular, took advantage of the power vacuum in Colombia to expand its operations. Previously, Mexican cartels had been primarily involved in smuggling Colombian cocaine into the United States. But as Escobar's death pushed the Colombian cartels into disarray, the Sinaloa cartel seized the opportunity to move from the periphery of the narcotics trade to its center. Under Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the Sinaloa cartel grew exponentially, developing intricate smuggling routes across Latin America and deep into the U.S. The Sinaloa cartel's ability to shift, adapt, and form strategic alliances with other criminal organizations made it an even more formidable force than Escobar's Medellín cartel had been. As the Sinaloa cartel grew in power, so too did the violence, corruption, and instability in Mexico. Meanwhile, Escobar's death left a complex and deeply painful legacy in Colombia. Many people, particularly in the poor barrios of Medellín, continued to remember Escobar not only as a drug kingpin but as a figure who had provided for the community in ways the government had failed to do. The homes, schools, hospitals, and soccer fields he built for the poor left a lasting imprint on the areas he controlled. In a nation ravaged by poverty and inequality, Escobar had presented himself as a Robin Hood-like figure, using his vast wealth to buy loyalty among those who had nothing. For some, his death was a tragic loss, while for others, it was the end of a reign of terror that had torn apart their communities. Yet the true nature of Escobar's legacy was far darker. His reign had been one of unimaginable violence. Thousands of lives were lost, both directly in the crossfire of cartel wars and indirectly through the corruption and destruction he fostered within Colombian society. The bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings carried out in his name left deep scars that would take decades to heal. His empire had destroyed lives, families, and entire neighborhoods. Even those who had benefited from his charitable acts were often left to grapple with the price of his empire's bloodshed. Though Escobar was gone, the specter of his empire remained. In many ways, the death of Pablo Escobar did not signal the end of Colombia's drug wars, but the beginning of a new, more fragmented and complex phase. The cartels grew more decentralized, and the global trade in cocaine became harder to control. The struggle for dominance in the world's drug trade continued, and Colombia, as a central player in the production of cocaine, remained entrenched in violence and instability. The legacy of Escobar and his empire continued to shape the nation, both in terms of its national psyche and in its ongoing battle against organized crime. The aftermath of Pablo Escobar's death left a Colombia still grappling with the seismic effects of his reign, while the international drug trade, far from collapsing, began to morph into an even more complex and decentralized structure. As Escobar's empire crumbled, various factions within the Medellín Cartel fought for control of his operations, but their efforts were not always successful. Even with Escobar dead and his immediate circle fractured, the vast networks that he had established persisted in Colombia and beyond. The desire for dominance in the global cocaine trade remained unquenched, and the drug cartels of Colombia were soon replaced by new, more insidious forces. The government, weakened by corruption and the scars of its previous battles, found itself facing a complex and seemingly endless struggle against these evolving criminal syndicates. The fight for control over Colombia's cocaine trade did not solely involve the remnants of Escobar's Medellín cartel. In fact, one of the most profound shifts in the post-Escobar world was the rise of the Cali cartel. Led by the Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers, the Cali cartel had always operated in Escobar's shadow, avoiding the violent tactics that had defined his empire. Escobar's larger-than-life presence had cast a long shadow, but with his death, the Cali cartel saw an opportunity to assert its dominance. The Rodriguez brothers, known for their strategic and often covert operations, quickly took over much of the cocaine production and distribution networks that Escobar had controlled. Unlike Escobar's brutal and overt tactics, the Cali cartel's rise was far more subtle. They didn't seek the public notoriety Escobar had reveled in. Instead, they quietly infiltrated the political system, bribing politicians and law enforcement officers while expanding their business operations. In many ways, the Cali cartel proved to be an even more dangerous adversary than Escobar's Medellín cartel had been because of their calm and calculated approach. Despite their success, the Cali cartel did not remain unchallenged. While they were able to establish control over key smuggling routes, particularly into the United States, they still faced competition from rival criminal organizations. The remains of Escobar's followers, desperate for survival, aligned themselves with other powerful cartels, including the Mexican cartels that had long been involved in the transportation of drugs into the U.S. The most notable of these was the Sinaloa cartel, which would go on to rise as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. As the Sinaloa cartel gradually moved into Colombia to take advantage of the destabilized environment, it added another layer of complexity to the already fractured cartel landscape. The Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, was adept at adapting to the changing dynamics of the drug trade, capitalizing on the weaknesses in the Colombian government's ability to enforce the law. The Mexican cartel's rise to power after Escobar's death was not merely the result of a shifting power vacuum in Colombia. The Mexican cartels, particularly the Sinaloa cartel, had long been intertwined with the cocaine trade but had largely operated at the periphery. With the Medellín cartel's collapse, the Mexican cartels began to assume a more central role in both the production and trafficking of cocaine. Their intricate network of connections between South America, Central America, and the United States allowed them to fill the void left by the Colombians. The Mexican cartels also took advantage of the increasingly decentralized nature of the drug trade, exploiting weaknesses in the security apparatus of Colombia and Mexico alike. By the mid-1990s, the Sinaloa cartel had become a dominant force, with Guzman at the helm orchestrating a transnational empire built on drug smuggling, money laundering, and violent control. As these new criminal organizations rose to prominence, the Colombian government found itself increasingly overwhelmed. The death of Escobar had not signaled a return to peace, rather, it had triggered a new phase of violence and power struggles. The Cali cartel, while less violent than the Medellín cartel, was still a force to be reckoned with. Escobar's former associates, many of whom had previously operated under his command, now found themselves facing the wrath of not only the Colombian authorities but also rival factions within the drug trade. The splintering of the Medellín cartel into smaller groups had created a chaotic environment where allegiances shifted rapidly, and betrayals were common. Cartels, once united by common goals, were now fractured into factions that fought for dominance. These factions resorted to brutal tactics, often targeting each other with assassinations, bombings, and kidnappings. The violence that had defined Escobar's reign persisted in the wake of his death, albeit in a more fragmented form. Despite the intense efforts of the Colombian government, aided by the United States, to combat the drug cartels, the war on drugs appeared to be an endless cycle. The government struggled to maintain control over areas that had once been under the cartel's influence. Rural regions, particularly those in the mountainous regions of Colombia, remained a haven for coca cultivation and drug production. The military's presence in these areas did little to curb the cocaine trade, as the cartels adapted quickly, creating new smuggling routes and methods to evade detection. The Colombian government was also hampered by corruption at every level. Many law enforcement officers, military personnel, and politicians were either on the payroll of the cartels or too afraid to take action. The line between the state and the criminal underworld had been thoroughly blurred, and it would take years for Colombia to begin to rebuild the trust and integrity of its institutions. The United States' involvement in Colombia's war on drugs grew exponentially following Escobar's death. The U.S. had long provided resources, intelligence, and financial aid to Colombia's government in its efforts to curb the drug trade. However, after Escobar's demise, the U.S. realized that the problem had not been solved, it had only shifted and grown more complex. The fragmentation of the cartels meant that U.S. agencies were no longer dealing with a singular enemy. The decentralized nature of the narcotics trade made it harder to track and dismantle the cartels. The United States found itself not only continuing its efforts in Colombia but also turning its attention to the emerging Mexican cartels. The global drug trade had evolved into a transnational network of criminals who were more adaptive, more resourceful, and more dangerous than ever before. Though Escobar's death and the subsequent dismantling of the Medellín cartel were hailed as victories by many, it was clear that the world had underestimated the resilience of the global drug trade. Escobar's death was merely a chapter in an ongoing saga that saw new criminal organizations rise to prominence in Colombia, Mexico, and beyond. As the Sinaloa cartel and other Mexican syndicates gained power, they developed increasingly sophisticated methods of drug production, trafficking, and distribution. Their ability to navigate the complex and evolving landscape of global drug trafficking only made the fight against them more difficult. The Mexican cartels proved to be more adaptable than their Colombian counterparts, employing a blend of violence and strategic alliances that allowed them to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. For Colombia, Escobar's death did not bring an end to the violence or the corruption that had plagued the nation. It merely set the stage for a new era of cartels, each vying for control over the drug trade that Escobar had left behind. The impact of his empire continued to resonate in Colombia's politics, society, and economy for years. The drug trade had become so entrenched that it was no longer simply an issue of law enforcement, it was a matter of national survival. Colombia's battle against the cartels became a battle for the soul of the nation itself, as the effects of Escobar's legacy lingered in every corner of Colombian life. In the wake of Escobar's death, the myth surrounding his persona grew larger. Escobar had become a symbol of both terror and wealth, a figure whose life inspired fascination, fear, and admiration. His story was told in countless documentaries, books, and films, each recounting the rise and fall of one of the world's most notorious criminals. For the people of Colombia, however, Escobar's legacy was far more complicated. To some, he was a hero who had built schools and homes for the poor, while to others, he was a villain who had wreaked havoc on the nation. The truth of his legacy was as murky as the waters of the Medellín River, where many of his victims had met their untimely end. The fragmented and evolving nature of the Colombian drug trade in the years after Escobar's death serves as a powerful reminder of how deeply ingrained the narcotics business had become in the fabric of Colombian society. While the government and law enforcement agencies continued their efforts to combat the growing tide of drug-related violence, it was clear that the war was far from over. Even in the absence of Escobar, Colombia continued to battle the forces he had unleashed, a global, decentralized network of drug traffickers that spanned continents and adapted to every new obstacle in its path. Escobar's death was not an end, but the beginning of a new, more complex chapter in the long history of Colombia's struggle with the drug trade. Even with the fall of Pablo Escobar and the crumbling of the Medellín Cartel, the drug trade in Colombia did not dissipate. In fact, the absence of Escobar's leadership sparked a turbulent transformation, where new and often more cunning players stepped into the void, eager to capitalize on the enormous profits that the cocaine trade continued to generate. As the global demand for cocaine remained high, the Colombian government's efforts to combat the growing influence of new cartels became increasingly difficult, as the fragmented nature of the drug trade made it far harder to control. Escobar had been a one-man empire, a figurehead that, for better or worse, embodied the structure and operations of the Medellín Cartel. His death, while symbolizing the end of an era, did not remove the deeply entrenched systems he had built. Instead, it ushered in an era of decentralization that brought new complexities, challenges, and ruthless figures who would soon dominate the global narcotics landscape. The most immediate beneficiary of Escobar's death was the Cali cartel. While the Medellín cartel had often employed violence as a tool of power, the Cali cartel was known for its more subtle, businesslike approach to the drug trade. The Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers, who headed the Cali cartel, had long operated under the radar, preferring to stay out of the media spotlight that Escobar had reveled in. In fact, many viewed the Cali cartel's rise to power as inevitable. The group had already established itself as a major player in the cocaine trade before Escobar's death, but after his demise, they took full advantage of the power vacuum and quickly gained control of much of the cocaine production and trafficking routes that Escobar had once controlled. Their ability to navigate the system of bribes and corruption allowed them to infiltrate various levels of government, law enforcement, and even the military. Unlike Escobar, who had relied on terror and intimidation to maintain control, the Cali cartel relied on bribery, alliances, and a more covert strategy that allowed them to avoid direct confrontation. This new form of control, while less flamboyant than Escobar's, proved to be equally, if not more, effective. Yet, despite the Cali cartel's dominance, the years following Escobar's death also saw the growth of other criminal organizations. As the Colombian drug trade became more decentralized, smaller factions of the Medellín cartel, as well as new players, sought to take control of various aspects of the cocaine business. The splintered remnants of the Medellín cartel engaged in violent power struggles with each other and with the newly rising Mexican cartels. The Sinaloa cartel, under the leadership of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, was among the first to move in and take advantage of the Colombian cartel's disarray. With their entrenched smuggling routes and their ability to adapt quickly to the changing dynamics of the cocaine trade, Mexican cartels were well positioned to establish themselves as dominant players. The Sinaloa cartel expanded its operations into Colombia and rapidly began to take over the production and trafficking of cocaine, shifting the center of power from Colombia to Mexico. This shift was crucial, as it signaled the beginning of a new era in the global drug trade, one in which Mexican cartels would become far more prominent than their Colombian counterparts. The growing influence of Mexican cartels was not the only challenge the Colombian government faced. As the cocaine trade splintered, Colombian law enforcement found itself battling an ever-expanding network of cartels, each more difficult to track and dismantle than the last. The Mexican cartels were not only involved in cocaine trafficking but also expanded their reach into other illicit activities such as marijuana, methamphetamine production, and the smuggling of heroin. Their ability to produce and distribute these drugs, combined with their strategic alliances with Colombian factions and other international criminal organizations, made them far more versatile and harder to combat than the Colombian cartels had been. As a result, the Colombian government's focus shifted from fighting a single, identifiable enemy like Escobar to dealing with an increasingly complex web of criminal organizations. These groups often work together, sharing routes, resources, and even technology, making the fight against them an uphill battle for law enforcement. The fragmentation of the drug trade had profound implications for Colombia's political and social landscape. The rise of Mexican cartels and the splintering of Colombian drug organizations fueled a new wave of violence that swept through the country. While the Cali cartel remained a significant power for a time, other groups, such as the North Coast Cartel and the Los Extraditables, a faction of former Medellín Cartel members, engaged in brutal turf wars. These violent conflicts brought chaos to Colombia's streets, leaving ordinary citizens to bear the brunt of the violence. As rival cartels fought for control over drug smuggling routes and production areas, entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds. The war between these cartels led to thousands of deaths, many of which were innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. The social fabric of Colombia began to tear as communities were displaced, families were torn apart, and the government's authority seemed increasingly fragile in the face of escalating violence. The Colombian government's inability to regain full control over the situation was compounded by rampant corruption. The line between the state and the cartels had become so blurred that it was often difficult to distinguish between those working to dismantle the cartels and those on the take. Escobar's legacy of bribery, intimidation, and political influence lived on in the form of new alliances and entrenched corruption at every level of Colombian society. Law enforcement officers, judges, and politicians continued to be bought off by cartel money, undermining efforts to rein in the drug trade. The violence and instability, fueled by the cartel's enormous financial power, meant that the Colombian government was not just fighting criminals, it was fighting an entrenched system that had been woven into the very fabric of its society. For the United States, the shifting landscape of the Colombian drug trade brought its own set of challenges. Escobar's death had been celebrated as a victory in the war on drugs, but U.S. officials quickly realized that the problems were far from over. While the Colombian cartels had been dismantled to some extent, new players, particularly from Mexico, were taking their place. The Sinaloa cartel and other Mexican syndicates quickly moved into Colombia and took over the cocaine trade, exploiting weaknesses in Colombia's efforts to control the production and trafficking of drugs. The U.S. also had to contend with a surge in heroin and methamphetamine trafficking, with Mexican cartels playing a central role in these new markets. The U.S. government responded by increasing its efforts to work with both Colombian and Mexican law enforcement agencies, providing training, financial support, and intelligence. However, despite these efforts, the continued demand for drugs in the U.S. made it difficult to reduce the flow of narcotics. The U.S. government had to confront the harsh reality that the war on drugs, particularly in Colombia, was a never-ending battle. Despite its best efforts, the demand for cocaine remained high, and as long as that demand existed, new cartels would continue to emerge to supply it. Escobar's death had shifted the focus of the war on drugs, but the underlying issue, the insatiable demand for narcotics, remained unchanged. Even as the U.S. spent billions of dollars supporting Colombia's anti-drug efforts, the resources seemed inadequate to stem the tide of drugs entering the country. The demand for cocaine was so pervasive that even the destruction of one cartel didn't create lasting change. Instead, it created a game of whack-a-mole, where the fall of one cartel simply allowed others to rise in its place.